thank you for that introduction, and good evening to all of you. Very many thanks to the Master, Professor Jeremy Morris, and the organisers for inviting me to speak to you about my experience of being a woman in academic life. I was, as Jeremy said, I was a PhD student here and a fellow of this college for very many years, and I love it. So I'm always delighted to be here, to meet friends, fellow colleagues, students and scholars, and of course to eat and drink here. I'm delighted to have some old friends here tonight. So I chose this title because I've sometimes reflected on or talked about my own career and working life using this term. Several times I've said, and I've meant it mainly as a positive observation, that I feel treated as an honorary man in my academic life. I mean mainly in my department and in my field. And this is quite a complex and paradoxical thing to say though, and it has a dark side. So I'm going to try and unpick what I mean by it in my remarks this evening, as well as to talk generally about the mainly exhilarating and rewarding aspects of my academic life to date. A senior colleague sent me an email last week saying, just a note to say I hope all goes well for the lecture on the 18th of May. I should be sorry both to miss the occasion and what you have to say. I fear I was an honorary man, though it suited me quite well. So I'm not alone in using this term, and several people have come to me saying, I feel like that too. So it has some kind of meaning. And my title, Women in Our Own Right, also refers to the book by Anne Dixon, A Woman in Your Own Right, which is a sort of self-help book on overcoming the need for approval and being who you are. I'll cover a bit of career history, so those of you I don't know can locate me. And before I formally start, I want to observe that whilst I'm clearly a successful woman on any objective criteria, I'm a professor of criminology and criminal justice and director of the Prisons Research Centre, as Jeremy said, at this great university. What I'm beginning to see around me, particularly amongst our highly international body of women students, makes me feel quite humbled. The upcoming generation have more confidence, energy, passion and competence than I ever had, and I feel privileged to watch you take on the world. I like what I see because it looks like progress. I wonder how many of you need self-help books on being a woman or on being confident and direct, and I'd be really interested to know later. So perhaps we can talk about that. But let me start with some encounters and a risky confession. So in 2008, I was invited to give a keynote lecture on the moral quality of prisons, this is my specialist area, at an international conference in Prague. I was greeted warmly afterwards by a Norwegian director of the Training Academy for Prison Staff, who congratulated me on my very fine lecture. His first words to me were, "I've read your book." He meant my book on prison officers, which explores what their work consists of at its best. It describes the right use of authority, a variety that's professional, humane, helpful and organised, and extremely difficult to accomplish. It's really very highly skilled work. He had liked the book a lot and had used it often with his trainee prison officers. His next words were, "I thought you were a man." A few years before this, one of my then PhD students returned from a trip to America to meet various academics relevant to his work, which was a kind of development of my work on suicides in prison. He was very excited by the trip and met lots of interesting and helpful people. One of them knew my work in this area and so congratulated him on having me as his supervisor. I don't know how the conversation proceeded after that, but reporting back, Joel, my student, said to me, "He thought you were a 70-year-old man." My voice, my writing, my work is well regarded, but it's constructed as masculine, aged masculine. Why is that, I wonder? Closer to home, an administrator in my department once casually suggested that one of the reasons my prisons class was so popular with students, who were at the time mainly male, was because she's such a lovely woman. I was deeply offended and a bit shocked. I thought the reason lots of students came to my class was because of the content and quality of the teaching. Shortly after I first arrived in Cambridge as a PhD student in 1987, this administrator, who is now long retired, came to me very apologetically to tell me she'd accidentally opened a very personal and sensitive letter. It was a sort of complaint about my unladylike behaviour. It had somehow followed me from my previous university, Hull, where I'd worked for 18 months on a Home Office funded research project following my 2-year master's degree there. The letter was a joke. It was a symbol of the outstanding relationships between myself and the group I had worked with. I'd been swimming with a colleague from another research team, and we'd got a bit boisterous in some pretend competition, and I'd accidentally scratched him. The correspondence we had was a kind of extended joke, and it involved the supervisor of both projects. So he wrote a joke, formal note to both of us, acknowledging my unladylike behaviour and suggesting that I apologise to him. So everyone had joined in with the teasing, but somehow the letter had followed me to Cambridge. So the administrator here had not been able to see the light-hearted nature of the exchange. She thought I was in serious trouble for unladylike behaviour and that this had been a serious complaint. That one took some explaining. So the last of these stories, more recently, sometime after I'd been promoted to professor here, this was around 2007, I got into a taxi ordered by our receptionist for Professor Liebling. The taxi driver said, "You don't look like a professor." "No," I said, not quite sure whether to feel flattered or offended. He was kind of right. When I arrived at this university in 1987, 4% of its professors were women. It's now 18.3%. The Russell Group average is 20.9%. More attention is paid to these figures now. They're published and you can find them on the internet. There's concern and attention paid to them. So there's lots of action now to both understand them and improve them. There's still a gender pay gap. There's still much work to be done. Those who celebrated my promotion with the most feeling and enthusiasm were women librarians and administrators in the Institute of Criminology and the porters at Trinity Hall, who'd all known me since I was a PhD student. The symbolism was recognised, in other words, by those with the least power. Gender is not the only variable that counts, and I'm well aware of that. Another of my PhD students, now with an academic job at another university, only told me towards the end of her PhD that she'd been asked many times over formal dinners here in Cambridge whether she was Anglia Ruskin, whenever she introduced herself as a student. She was mixed race and she came from Birmingham, which is where I grew up, my home city. She faced a combination of race, class and geographical discrimination that Brummies know only too well throughout her PhD. And I was deeply saddened both to hear her story but also to hear it so late in our working relationship. Experiences of discrimination so often remain silent and silenced. But now, my guilty confession. Very many years ago, I was invited to give a talk at a regional secure unit in the Midlands by a Dr. Brockman. I corresponded with Dr. Brockman's secretary now and again, making the various arrangements. When I was met at the entrance by a smart-looking, slender woman, I shook her hand and said, "Are you Dr. Brockman's secretary?" She said, "I'm Dr. Brockman." Caught. I'd thought she was a man. What is going on here? If I think power comes in a man's shape, how can we educate men and women, that is ourselves, to acknowledge and celebrate legitimate female power? Now, I'm talking to you this evening as an exceptionally satisfied professional woman who loves her job, probably has the best research team in the world, in terms of the combined commitment, enthusiasm, values, personal qualities, and talent. Our students are outstanding and they're a pleasure to teach. We learn a great deal from them. I live at, sometimes on, and occasionally over the edge of my own competence all the time, doing what I love to do and being rewarded for it. My job is stressful and extremely demanding, but it's deeply satisfying, collegiate and meaningful, and I feel privileged to be doing it. I entered academic life somewhere between the dark days of exclusion and overt discrimination against women, one example of which I'll share with you in a minute, and the lighter days of liberation, opportunity, and repair of some of that discrimination, of which I stand here as an example. This trajectory is not necessarily all linear. There are backward steps, blind spots, or hidden forms of exclusion that reappear or that become the unintended consequences of a brutally competitive economy. But perhaps I'll return to these risks of equal opportunities for women in academic life at the end. I was strongly encouraged by my then head of department to apply for promotion to professor. I would have waited at least another year. He pointed out that I had the right profile and had just published a major book, and he argued that I had a strong case. I spent 3 weeks filling in the application form with the typical conscientiousness and perfectionism of women in academic life. I learned that my male colleagues who'd been promoted before me had a far less conscientious and more blasé and efficient attitude to form filling. One of my favourite colleagues put in his CV, and if you want to promote me, here's my CV, compared to my 3 weeks of hard work. But I remember thinking, only when I got to the end of the form filling process, that I actually did meet all the criteria. I had to see the evidence in writing and organised under headings before I believed it. Preparing for this evening also reminded me that when I was successful in being awarded a junior research fellowship at Trinity Hall, the process had been very similar. I had intended to apply for a non-stipendiary fellowship at Wootton College, which was something I felt more confident about because I had independent research funding. As with the professorship, I'd waited a year longer than many men do, completing my PhD and starting a Home Office funded project before mustering up the confidence to apply. I asked my tutor, Dr. David Thomas, to write me a reference, and he agreed, but only on the condition that I also applied for stipendiary research fellowships, which were more competitive. So I complied to get the reference I needed, which meant I was very relaxed at my formal interview here at Trinity Hall and quite enjoyed talking about my work with several great minds. I think Graham might have been one of those great minds, because I didn't really think I was likely to get the position. When I did, I was so taken aback, I went to see David Thomas in a bit of a daze and said, "Do you think I should accept it?" He looked at me and said, probably masking some exasperation, "Alison, there is something about junior research fellowships that mean you don't ask yourself that question." "Okay," I said, and only later discovered what he meant. I was one of 5 women fellows here, so I'm very interested to meet and hopefully have conversation with the first and only woman student here at the time. Those days of intellectual exchange, friendship, relative freedom and security will stay with me forever. A Trinity Hall Junior Research Fellowship is a sort of intellectual paradise with the luxury of food, wine and a flat at Whitchfield thrown in. Those years now feel dreamlike. Thinking about them this week made me feel like Captain Charles Ryder when he returns to Brideshead during the war, et in Arcadia ego. They have a kind of magic power, the phantoms of which can still take flight. And they did when I reflected on them. This world is an enclosed and enchanted garden. I met 3 of the most important intellectual friends I have, or have had, during those years. Jonathan Steinberg, who was then the Vice Master, Charles Eliot, who was then the Dean, and an extraordinary Scottish prison governor, Alistair MacDonald, who was not a fellow here, but who was made so welcome on his regular visits to dinners and conferences in this college that he felt himself almost like one. Trinity Hall is a master at intellectual occasions, masking them as refined social occasions. During those years, I grew in confidence and felt part of a scholarly family, a sort of intellectual holding environment, with mutual trust, support, and collaboration at the heart of it. Because I came from a, let's say, mixed-up background, comprehensive school, 2 normal universities, York and Hull, professional parents, but both from working-class families and the first of their generation to go to university, and then various adversities, including divorces and remarriages. And on top of that, I was an arts or literature child in a medical family. I had never felt at home or nourished as a swot or as a bookworm, words used with some scorn. Here, I was regarded, and I saw it in writing, as an intellectual. My father was worried that I was too independent to make a good marriage. Here, that independence is nurtured. I'll come back to my work and working life later, but let me divert for a moment to the dark days, since we can't think adequately about where we are now without a bit of history. My example of the dark days happens to be a criminologist, Barbara Wootton. She was a social scientist and public intellectual who lived from 1897 to 1988. I've discovered, since preparing this lecture, that the Nuffield Foundation have funded a biography of her, which I've ordered, and that her archives are held at Girton. I encountered her outstanding work when I was a master's student in criminology, thanks to my then supervisor at Hull University. I learned that she was the first woman to give lectures at Cambridge University, the first to be a member of a National Policy Commission, the first to become a life peer in the House of Lords, where she became Deputy Speaker in 1965. She got the bill to abolish capital punishment through the Lords and onto the statute book. She had a deep antipathy to violence. She was the first president of the British Sociological Association from 1959 to 1964. She wrote books on economics, politics, penal policy, and the social sciences with a critical eye that often prompted anger. She upset the entire establishment and wielded more power than any other woman in the country, according to her biographer, Anne Oakley. The New York Times called her one of the ablest people in England, so she's a bit of a heroine. She achieved all this at a time when women were discriminated against in ways that now seem both cruel and absurd. I only learned later that while she gained special distinction in her economics exam at Girton, an honour that had not been conferred on any student at Cambridge, male or female, in the history of the subject, she wasn't able to claim her degree. No woman could. And when she became the first woman to lecture at Cambridge in 1921, aged 24, her talks were advertised as being delivered by a Mr. Henderson. Only a footnote revealed the true lecturer's identity. I came to Cambridge as a PhD student in 1987, only then to find out what kinds of obstacles my heroine had faced. What kind of a place is this, I thought. My own experience, of course, has been vastly different. I more or less sailed through my PhD happily, was awarded research fellowships at Trinity Hall, from Leverhulme, from the ESRC, and was made a principal investigator on several consecutive Home Office grants, and I was appointed to a permanent lectureship here in 2000. At that stage, I was given a small grant to establish the Prisons Research Centre, which now has 21 disproportionately female staff and PhD students, and a turnover of some millions. I've written many books, edited journals, and led very many research projects. No one has ever credited a random man for my achievements. They just think I might be one. I'm well aware that I have a voice that's listened to in my professional life, and particularly in relation to the prisons world. And I've sometimes wondered how and why this is the case. Women governors, governors of prisons, so women governors especially of male prisons, describe some serious difficulties in getting their voices heard or their authority accepted among mainly male colleagues, and especially in the eyes of mainly male prison staff who think that power is man-shaped. This cultural habitus is reflected in an organisation infused with what some critics call toxic masculinity. Women governors often describe having to change their personal style in order to find ways of persuading male audiences of their legitimacy. This can have negative effects on their personal lives and relationships. A close friend, an ex-prison governor, wrote her thesis about the direct tension she experienced between her feminine role in a relationship and her role and identity in the workplace. Authority and femininity are still regarded as incompatible. One scholar, a woman who publishes under the male name Adrienne Howe, argues in her book, Punish and Critique, towards a feminist analysis of penality, that all disciplinary power is gendered, and that women are subject to all kinds of non-penal forms of disciplinary power via the family and the community. The gaze, or the paradox of women's exaggerated physical and sexual visibility and their vocal and civic invisibility, make them self-disciplining and docile. No wonder there are so few women offenders. Criminologists are interested in women because they offend so little, relatively speaking. And when they do, the explanation for their offending is located in their sex role deviance. They're in moral danger, in danger of not being pure women. Women make up around 5% or less of prison populations all over the world. When they offend, they're regarded as acting against womanhood. Young women grow into femininity, whereas young men are said to grow out of adolescent masculine aggression. Women are over-socialised and over-policed, informally, discursively, within the family and outside of it. They're structurally coerced in many subtle ways as well as obvious ways to control themselves and try to please. The moral danger they encounter in their lives is, of course, masculine, but they're held accountable for its effects. Adrian Howe argues that anorexia can be seen as one manifestation of the exaggerated tendency women have to internalise the disciplinary gaze and to regulate the size, contours, and appetites of their bodies. This is an outcome of patriarchal structures of power that silence and exclude, and yet do not have a headquarters. Of course, deviant masculinities are also policed and excluded. I see these structures and their effects among my female and some male colleagues and students, as well as some breaking out from and challenging of such structures. I'm gaining more and more female colleagues and role models as time goes on, some of the most impressive and encouraging of whom are from outside the UK. When Helen Mirren said recently that her 2 words of advice to maturing women were, "Get wilder," I warmly welcomed them. That's the kind of advice we need to hear. So back to my very positive experience of research life in the prisons world, I occupy an unusual and arguably privileged role on the edge of the organisation, granted privileged access and having a strong voice in and around the organisation. Prison governors respect and revere education, so being a professor is a very acceptable identity with an off-grid form of power that doesn't threaten, although in some ways it does. The power of authentic description can be mighty. This was very different when I first started out as a student and then research assistant doing fieldwork in mainly male prisons. I did experience sexual harassment and inappropriate questions about what my boyfriend thought about me doing a job like this then. In my first project, before I started my PhD, I worked as a research assistant on a project led by a male professor. The post involved fieldwork in 3 prisons for about 8 weeks in each. So in each prison, there was a settling in period, finding an office, getting to know the staff, and starting to carry out interviews. In my second prison, Northallerton, I thought I was starting to get the hang of prisons research. Not so. This prison, which was closed in 2013, was ancient and traditional. It had originally opened in 1788, and its buildings had been added throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. It had at one time the largest treadmill in the world. My office was a cell, and I couldn't see the face of the orderly, a trusted prisoner, who occasionally made me tea from a cabin outside in the grounds. He pushed the mug through the open grille at my window, the window of my cell office. One day there was a knock at the door. A large principal officer opened it and stood in the doorway looking at me. Outside the door were the radial wings of a traditional prison. "Hello," he said, and paused. "I just want you to know that I don't approve of women working in my prison." And with that, he shut the door. Oh, I thought, better find some allies. My ally in those days was a hippie male assistant governor with good social work skills. Later in my research life, I found ways of building trust with even sceptical prison officers. That's another very long story and for another occasion. These days, I'm very aware of my privileged role on the edge of the prison service organisation and the fact that what I say seems to get listened to, almost beyond my comfort zone. I've escaped the gender trap in the prisons world and have felt treated gracefully in it. I have long felt treated, accepted, constructed, I'm not sure yet of the right word, as an honorary man in my department, in terms of my status, which feels very equal. I can't complain about ever feeling discriminated against there, quite the contrary. Some of that is related to the fact that I like quantitative research methods, so I like statistics and have always used them, as well as qualitative research methods, which are seen as a bit soft and feminine. It also seems to be grounded in some combination, then, of my masculine intellectual credentials and acceptable femininity, which is why I might want to think about it some more. I've quietly resisted gender stereotypes throughout my life in many ways without really knowing why. I wanted what the boys had: freedom of movement, interesting sports, a self-actualizing life. I wanted to be read and taken seriously by men as well as by women. Once or twice I've observed that I live like a man, as my most serious hero, George Eliot, did. She understood the attractions of masculine authority, but she also understood that it could crush and exclude. Sometimes being made welcome in a man's world goes wrong, and we lose ourselves. Some of my career success has been thanks to male patronage, which I have to admit I've welcomed despite its dangers. I probably lacked the confidence and ambition to take what have turned out to be the most important steps in my career without their support. But accepting support is a very different thing from succeeding on terms set by men. I hope I support the women I teach and work with, because I can see how smart they are, but they still so often seriously underestimate themselves. I still get nervous about my teaching. Sometimes my students find this surprising. Women authors, Berg and Bieber, who I'll mention at the end in a moment, interpret this nervousness as eagerness. See what happens when women take to theorizing our universe. They do it kindly. Of course, healthy nervousness needs to be distinguished from feelings of unworthiness and shame, the intensely painful feeling of believing that we're flawed. This is something else that Berg and Bieber point out. So, to the present and the future. I was quite taken by surprise when preparing this talk, when I strayed into Arcadia, or my nostalgia for the early years as a fellow in Trinity Hall. I actually found it very emotional to think about these years, just at the moment. Some of this is personal. I have scattered the ashes of both of my parents in their meaningful places only 10 days ago and 6 months ago, respectively. And this has led to considerable reminiscence and reflection. But when I reread Evelyn Waugh's account of the bleak period of privation and the sense of threatening disaster that he opens Brideshead with, I wondered if coping with Brexit, Trump, a prison world in chaos, and some threats to core values in university life linked to economic rationalism might lie behind my nostalgic feelings about an earlier era. 2 books completely capture my aspirations for, as well as my anxieties about university life. The first is called The Slow Professor, Challenging the Culture of Speed in the Academy, and it's by Maggie Berg and Barbara Sieber. I can't recommend it highly enough. I found it last year. It was published in 2016. The other book is What Are Universities For? By Stefan Collini, 2012. Both books argue that the role of the university is intellectual, educational, scientific, and cultural, rather than narrowly economic, and that inquiry requires ungovernable play and a distinctive kind of organisation. As Collini writes, the distracted, numbers-swamped, audit-crazed, grant-chasing life of most contemporary academic departments is far removed from the classical ideals of the contemplative life. The experience of being a senior academic now, especially one involved in chairing a department or directing a research centre, may seem to more closely resemble that of being a middle-rank executive in a business organisation than it does of being an independent scholar or freelance teacher. While the conditions of work of junior and temporary staff in some unfavoured institutions may suggest comparisons with those of staff in a call centre. We risk heading further toward that condition, satirised long ago by Keynes, in which we become, I quote, capable of shutting off the sun and the stars because they do not pay a dividend. His analysis is stark but recognisable, and I worry, as many of us do, that the ideological concept of knowledge as useful is destructive. Berg and Sieber argue similarly, reminding us that good books take 5 years to write. Their analysis is gendered, so they characterise the contemporary environment as corporate and remasculinized. What gets noticed and promoted is swagger, long hours, individual competitiveness, combativeness, assertive polemic taken as evidence of intelligence, and prizing productivity over collegiality, all fired up by neoliberal economy. They argue that universities are still highly sexist institutions and that the new economy privileges macho practices, culture, and style. They also argue that when we are rushed, we are simply not the people we are capable of being. They call for a slow professor movement in which we act with purpose, taking the time for deliberation, reflection, and dialogue, cultivating emotional and intellectual resilience. I prefer the word aliveness to the term resilience. Intellectual inquiry should not be instrumental. We're not delivering knowledge outputs. We are engaged in original, creative research and thinking, and in nurturing the intellectual lives of others. This kind of work has the bonus that it's a joy to engage in. Its opposite, the knowledge widgets game, is soul-destroying. I have more faith in the younger generation than Evelyn Waugh or Charles Ryder had in his bleak opening to Brideshead Revisited. I still find doing the research I do wildly exhilarating, even if I sometimes have to look in prisons abroad, in Norway and the Netherlands, to easily find the kinds of values and practices I get excited about. Most of my work focuses on the use of authority, its changing shape and its effects, and the differences between good or right and bad versions of authority. I don't specialise in the study of women, even though people assumed I might at the outset, but neither do I leave women out. Women have a different relationship with freedom, with authority, and with power. They have less access to all of these, particularly in some parts of the world. They're also extraordinary. My advice to my younger colleagues is trust yourselves, find your voices, make them authentically yours, support each other, grow good friends, take men with you on this journey, be creative, and change the world. And as Helen Mirren said, get wilder. Thank you very much.
Alison, thank you very much indeed for that wonderful blend of experience and advocacy. I'm sure it's going to produce lots of questions and discussion, so the floor is over to you. Who would like to begin?
Hello, I'd be curious to know how big a part having a network of other female academics has been in your life and success.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Shall I answer each question as they come?
Yeah.
Thank you for that. In my early days, there just weren't enough of them around, and I felt quite lonely, and I couldn't look upwards. I couldn't find women above me, and there's so few of them that the ones that exist are frantically busy. But one of the disadvantages of success in a minority is that once, for example, you become a professor, everyone wants you to be on their committee because there ought to be a woman on the committee. And so I think it has its burdens as well as its kind of pleasures. So for a long time, I didn't have networks of women. But what I've noticed, probably in the last 5 years or a bit more, is I'm starting to accumulate. Actually, interestingly, some of my closest colleagues are my former PhD students who've become professors. And they're my closest intellectual friends now. And that's wonderful, a group who I'm kind of growing, but I'm watching them thrive in other universities, and we've stayed very close. But I'm also finding more women beginning to move upwards who are my kind of age and status, and we're starting to gather forces. And it's not a deliberate thing, but I'm finding we're hanging out together quite a lot, finding ways of doing research projects together. So now there are plenty, but it's quite recent.
Well, thanks, Alison, for a wonderful talk. Two things I wanted to pick up. The first was, I don't know if I was alone in finding the statistic of 5% of offenders being women. That was just something I didn't know.
Really?
And it's an extraordinary figure. And I want to ask you to speak a bit more about it in the light of the idea that we are not angels.
Yeah.
So if women are not angels, you know, what do we learn by this extraordinary statistic? I mean, where does our aggression and our badness go?
Yeah.
You know, it's a fascinating question. Second point was just to come to the end, and your marvellously powerful commentary on sort of non-instrumental understandings of the university. And I guess, again, it was given added power by the fact that the work that you've done over the past years and decades, you know, could not be more socially significant in the sense of the crisis of prisons, the epidemic of suicide, and so on and so forth. And so I guess I just wanted to ask you to say a bit more about, you know, your work is, you know, it's couldn't be more, you know, relevant to policy and so on and so forth. And yet you're the person saying to us, you know, with great eloquence, we should not mistake that potential for the purposes of what we do.
Yeah.
I was just interested in that.
Yeah. Thank you. Two wonderful questions. The first one about the 5% of women. It's interesting for me that this is a surprise because we take this a little bit for granted. All sentencing and the penal system students should know it, of course. And I'll tell you an anecdote that the ex-director of our head of department, I'm sure you won't mind me telling you this joke, that Professor Bottoms, when he had his first child was a girl, and when he heard, he wasn't at the birth, it was a long time ago, and his first words were, on hearing that he'd had a girl, "Oh good, she's only got a 5% chance of becoming a criminal." Which I think he really said, but he tells that story as a joke. And of course, it's all over the world, so there's a lot going on. And so one of the things that's going on, as all our criminology students will know, two different things, that women are treated more leniently by the courts if they look like proper women. So there is a kind of leniency thing going on. If they don't look like proper women, then they can end up being doubly punished. And so there is a minority of women, but they tend to fit a non-feminine stereotype profile, and they end up getting very long sentences often. But your more interesting question was what happens to, where does our aggression and badness go? And of course, it's a cliche, but women turn it on themselves. And that's why I mentioned Adrienne Howe. Her book is really, really powerful. And it's about punishment and how you misunderstand punishment if you leave women out of the analysis. Because theorists of punishment think it's about economics, and that, you know, the imprisonment rate and the kind of economy tend to be related. But that's only true for men. And that if you enter women into the picture, then that muddies the waters, and punishment is about something else. And of course, she's also saying it's not just penal, that discipline, women are socially controlled in so many ways, and this is so effective. They are self-governing creatures. They take on their own social control. And so there's all sorts of interesting reasons why women are less likely to break the law. And it happens way before the kind of courts and punishment system. So I think that raises all sorts of interesting questions about women and what we do with our aggression. And then your second question, again, a tough one, and obviously it's important. I'm thinking about this quite a lot because when I started doing prisons research, the world was a different place. And I was on a very much reform trajectory where there was a kind of liberal consensus that prisons were pretty bad in the 1980s and most people were trying to make them better, whilst believing that prisons were not good places to send people. And so it was very easy to do research and not be much of a campaigner. I would make my research available to the people who were in campaigning organisations, and there was a consistent view about what we were trying to do collectively. That's all changed, and we're in a very, very different world now. And I suppose what I see is there's a sort of desperation for evidence, but what that word means, evidence, is something very narrow and circumscribed. I'll give you an example that I've been asked to go to Hong Kong to talk to a corrections conference about something, and when they invited me, they said they'd spend 2 days showing me their prisons. They know how to get me to agree to things. So, yeah, all right, I'll come. Only if I can be shown around your prisons. And then on day 3 and 4, there's some conference. So I thought, well, if they're asking me, they obviously want me to talk about my work. And then I got an email to say, we've sent out the programme and you're giving a lecture on world developments in prison rehabilitation. And I looked at this thinking, hang on a minute, that's not what I do. And I'm not sure that what I see happening in prisons has anything to do with rehabilitation, and that we're actually a very long way from that. But there's a whole industry of research going on trying to demonstrate that little programs are making a difference to outcomes. People are losing interest in what I'm interested in, which is forms of order in prison, and what the difference is between legitimate and illegitimate forms of order, and how that underpins everything that happens in those prisons. And if we have an illegitimate form of order, they become unsafe, prisoners take their own lives, you have damage to character and civic disposition, they begin to undermine social order. Nobody's asking about that stuff, because what the ideology is prisons are good, we can run them cheaply, but we've got some programs that will fix people. And they want research on that. And so there's a struggle, a really serious struggle, between the kind of research speak and world, which is quite narrow and it has a particular kind of expertise in it, and what I do, which is sociological research, which tries to just ask serious questions about what's going on here. And because there's such a tension, in a way, the kind of research I do takes time and care, and it's not always going to give the results that are wanted. So I think that means if you want to do research with impact, it seems to have to come under this sort of category of what I see as quite ideologically driven, quite blind research. And the sort of research I want to do, still try to do, you have to almost do in the kind of margins of these other projects. I think that's how I think about that tough, very tough question.
Okay, thank you. There's a question at the back.
Hi. As one of the students, undergraduates, we've heard quite a few stories about female students being told to write like a man.
Right.
And I was wondering what advice you have for the contradiction between thinking like a woman and wanting to consider many views and do them justice, and being told to write like a man in order to succeed.
Yeah, that's amazing, but so recognisable. And I suppose it comes back to my title and my own work and my own voice, and the fact that it's regarded as a male voice, and what does that mean? And I think when I see my own students, what I find in my women students is that they're incredibly conscientious, but they're not bold, and they cover the territory, but they don't have a voice of their own. So I think getting this balance right between, I wouldn't use the term write like a man, but I think what I said at the end, find your own voice, but it has got to be somehow an authoritative voice. And the word authoritative, I said earlier that authority and femininity are kind of seen as in conflict, and I can see it happens every year, the difference in the confidence and writing style of my male and female students at every level, all the way up to PhD and postdoc level, stands out. And I do try to encourage my women students to be less tentative, feel authoritative when you write your essay. But I'm not saying write like a man. It's actually quite a subtle distinction, I think, and maybe we should talk about it more collectively, because women it's still the case that women get good 2-1s, and they get good 2-1s because of this, because they know the stuff and they can reproduce it and they can think about it, but they don't often hit you between the eyes with how they've thought about it originally, and they need to, but in their own way.
Firstly, thank you for a wonderful talk. I like the call. In my career, I've experienced being an honorary man as well. And I wondered about the concept of an honorary woman, and whether that could exist, and where, and what it might look like, just in your opinion.
That's a very interesting question. And I did think of someone as soon as you said it, but you might not like me for saying this. Actually, I'm really, really lucky in my Prisons Research Centre. I have a deputy who is, I think, one of the best men I could possibly have ever worked with. He studied masculinity. His PhD was on masculinity and the men's magazine industry, and then somehow he got interested in prisons and came to see me, and we started to work together, and we've worked together now for about 15 years. And as I was writing this, I was thinking how fortunate I am that he and I are actually not very far apart in our values, and we often do interviews, long interviews together, and there's almost nothing between us. When we have a debrief afterwards, we respond to people in almost the same way. Every now and again there's a difference, and where there is a difference, it's gendered. So sometimes he takes against powerful men, and sometimes I take against what I call brittle women, which I mean by women, young women governors who are so sort of anxious about having their authority recognised that they become slightly punitive towards staff. So, I mean, he would hate to be called an honorary woman, but he's the kind of man it's very easy to have a good research partnership with. And I think he stands out. When I was thinking about this, thinking about masculinity, I was thinking, well, actually, my colleague is a bit of an exception. And there's others like him. But I think he'd probably... Whereas do I mind being called an honorary man? I think it needs deconstructing and its dark side acknowledging. I suspect he would object much more to being called an honorary woman.
Just here. Sorry. And then...
Thanks. Yeah, you've just referred again to the possible dark side of women, in a sense, trying to reinvent themselves or trying to present as honorary men. And one of the great things about your talk was the number of sort of individual sort of stories that you've told. I wondered if you had any thought, or were willing to share any thoughts on what the effect on the institutions you've talked about, academia and the prison service, might be, either positive or negative, of women going through that process rather than actually allowing those institutions to benefit from them behaving as women in every respect.
If I've understood, so your question is if women
were actually simply being unashamedly women
yes.
in their institutional context, what might those institutions gain? What might they be losing at the moment by not acknowledging that? Because of the compromises people are making.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's when I read this book, The Slow Professor, and I noticed that it was written by two women, and I felt like it's not all about gender, because Stefan Collini is saying the same thing, but I liked their particular take, and somehow it felt like their characterisation of modern management, modern managerialism, I've called macho for years, words like robust, that's why I don't like the word resilient. This language is a brutal language, and I think our language would be very different. And so I love their slow professor movement. I think it makes perfect sense, and it's a slightly different set of values. So I've also gone back to Carol Gilligan and her In a Different Voice book, which I know it's had a lot of critique, but I feel like she's saying something really important, that if we have a dominant masculine perspective, we think justice looks a particular way. And if women enter the dialogue, we realise it looks another way, and that we add something really important to our understandings of justice. So I think you're right that women should be able to make themselves heard and felt on their own terms. But I think, coming back to the question earlier about write like a man, not if what we mean by on their own terms means lacking confidence and authority, because I think we should own it. But I think that's our struggle.
Thank you for your inspiring talk. I've heard many talks about women in academia. I've even given one myself. And I think what's refreshing about what you said, and what really stands out to me, is that actually you haven't talked about motherhood, which is so often part of the message. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm particularly interested in what you think could be done in terms of structural changes for women in academia. And I suspect your answer is not going to be, well, it's all about maternity leave. That there's more to it than that.
Yeah. Yes, I thought about it. Obviously, it comes up, and a lot of the women in my department, it's part of their struggle, and I see it and see some of the challenges and difficulties. But obviously, I don't think it's the answer. I can remember there being a struggle in our department. We still call it a new building. There was an issue about whether one of our postdocs could bring her newborn child to the office, and we all said, brilliant, if she brings this child to the office, we'll all get a go to play with it, babysit, all that stuff. And then we got told it was inappropriate and there'd be health and safety. What if the baby jumps out the window? All those sorts of things. So I think the problem is institutional. It's not about how we live our lives, because in other jurisdictions where we know there are fewer disparities, there isn't major differences in women's competence or the number of hours they spend in the workplace. So I think it is important, but I didn't deliberately miss it out. But I think in the same way that I avoided specialising in the study of women's prisons, I think motherhood is a risky place to start if we want to talk about women's equality in the workplace and in academic life.
So you mentioned how only 5% of women end up in the prison system as compared with what proportion of that 5% then is ethnic minorities then? Is disproportionate, or now you find the special case of not only are you a woman, but you're also an ethnic minority, and then do you see even starker differences?
Yes, you do. I don't have the figures at my fingertips, but my rough memory is that there's definitely more than 50% of women serving prison sentences would come from black or mixed race minority groups, and this is much higher than the already disproportionate figure for men. So for men it's about 25% overall, for women it's more than 50%. So yes, it's not just about, it's the combination of exclusions.
Following on from that question, the higher number of black and ethnic minorities, do you think that's linked to images of femininity and people diverging from that, and black and ethnic minorities facing different standards of femininity in courts, that sort of thing?
Yes, I think that's part of the story. I think there's something about women's offending profile too, and there's something about foreign national women ending up getting quite long prison sentences for drug importation, for example, when they're not the major kind of orchestrator of the offence, but they're very easy to apprehend. So I think there's a whole series of issues that explain that disproportion. So if you go into a women's prison, it's quite a distressing sight to find all nationalities, quite a lot of non-speaking of English, women collaborating together over the care of children under the age of about 18 months. It gives you a very shocking kind of insight into these questions. Among them is about dissatisfied expectations of femininity, but there's all sorts of other things about powerlessness and women's economic role in drug-related offences and so on, too.
We've got a little more time left. Yeah.
Hello. I was struck when you described the earlier part of your career about saying how it had been brought forward by people encouraging you, specific people encouraging you to make applications. Yeah. And I was at an Athena Swan talk this morning, actually, and a female speaker was saying there that she was only in the academic position she was in because someone had specifically encouraged her to make an application. Yeah. And it strikes me as this is potentially... there are many more people that would share that story. And I wondered if you had any insight into what we can do, whether there's something more systemic we can do, other than hope there are good role models to encourage individual women to make these applications.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, this wasn't something I was particularly aware of until other people pointed it out or I got the encouragement. I remember the year I applied, there was a letter went round from the university encouraging women to make applications to professorship. So you could see that women were sort of being targeted and encouraged, and that there are some structural things. It does feel like there is stuff going on that's beginning to make a difference. But it's really hard. I think that's why we don't have these conversations. I mean, this is actually the first time I've ever thought systematically about this question. Because you just get on with your job and you kind of notice things. But it wasn't until I started, it was after I'd chosen my title, it just came. I'm going to give this talk. What should I talk about? That. So I knew there was something about being an honorary man. But then I didn't know what I was going to say, which is why I couldn't send Emma the abstract until I'd written this, because I didn't know what I was going to say. But I was amazed how much came out. And all these stories, I'd sort of forgotten them all, but they all came back about this kind of, oh, she's a man, she's an old man, you know. And suddenly you realise, here's a whole narrative. And I didn't even really understand there was a narrative. And so all I know is that I don't like female students crying in my office because they don't have any confidence, and I know how smart they are. And it happens all the time. And I deal with the individual in front of me. I try and build up their confidence, I believe in them, and I hope that this makes a difference. But it actually takes a kind of mindset, a different sort of mindset, to start thinking structurally. And I suspect writing this talk has kind of radicalised me slightly. And of course, as you get older in your professional life, you start wanting to think about the next generation and how you're going to make a difference. So I think it's actually quite a step change to go from realising your own story and then what this means for the generation coming up behind you. So I think we've got a long way to go.
more questions. One
we all know that gender is a scale, and I freely admit I would say that I'm at the masculine end of the feminine scale because I had an older brother that I looked up to a lot probably. But I've often been told by men, wow, you think like a man.
Yeah.
And they say it as a compliment, I think, but at the same time a little bit maybe disapproving that I'm not a woman or being as feminine as I could be. And do you think there is this dichotomy that we are expected to be feminine and be female and yet at the same time display masculine traits, that it seems like a double-edged sword, that you're expected to be feminine, but then if you do something that would actually, you know, up your game, and sometimes I get told I think like a man just because I've made a rational argument, and that infuriates me because they're like, wow, that's so rational, you think like a man. Have you come across that?
It's so funny. I'm part of a reading group now, organised by one of my PhD students, and we're reading Tolstoy's Resurrection. We've just finished it, and we're reading it aloud to each other. And I had to read a chapter which I'd forgotten about, and it was only as I was reading it I realised I almost couldn't read it, because it was Tolstoy describing one of his characters as, you know, typically male, totally rational, and then one of his female characters as, you know, utterly all over the place and totally emotional and therefore morally suspect. And I could almost not get the words out. And I think that was what I was sort of saying when I think about this. How did I get this honorary man status then? Well, it is a combination of masculine intellectual credentials, in inverted commas, and acceptable feminine identity. And I think I was looking around me and thinking about the other women I've come across and how they kind of position themselves in academic life. And there is a whole spectrum, and there's a body of prison researchers who are feminist abolitionist. So they're feisty and they want to abolish prisons. And none of them ever get access to a prison. Right, so they do their research in unbelievably convoluted ways. They have to find ex-prisoners. They do it by phone calls. You know, they spend their lives trying to get access to an institution that just won't let them in. And this is really interesting for me because a lot of this is in Australia and Canada, and I'm being invited to go and do research in Canada and Australia, and they've got their own people who they won't let in, and this creates havoc. And I'm trying to build prisons research centres in these places so that local knowledge can do the research. But it's about positioning, and that's what I mean. The dark side means I have to think: am I over-conforming? Am I holding back? All of those sorts of questions. So I think it is a sort of it's quite a fine line we tread. Those of us who make it through. So.
We've probably got time for one more question.
In response to the previous question, you were saying that there's still a long way to go. So as someone who's spent a lot of time in academia, do you have any advice to give to an undergraduate, maybe like me, who's also experienced forms of sexism in what I'm doing?
Yeah. I've tried. I think in my talk there's lots of implicit advice, and when I said that I was really sorry when my PhD student, who I had a really good relationship with, but she didn't tell me till the very end about her discrimination experiences, and it made me feel really sad because I hadn't realised, I didn't know that was her experience, and I wished she'd told me earlier, because if we'd been able to talk about it, I might have been able to challenge it on her behalf. I would have made sure she was in places where she might have been excluded. So I think the point I made about discrimination being silent and silenced was really a bit of a call for students, not just female students, anyone who experiences exclusion or discrimination, to build enough trust with the institution they belong to, with somebody in the institution they belong to be able to talk about it. Because there are people with a bit more power further up in the organisation who would be horrified and would want to try and help, challenge, support. So I think speaking is really important.
Okay, I think probably, Alison, we should allow you to rest your voice. It's been really fantastic. Thank you very much for your openness and your inspiration. Can we all show our applause again?